everybody. Welcome to the 4-on-1 show. I am Dave Hooper. We are broadcasting from our secret anti-Illuminati remote location for the next few weeks while we get some editing done on the Anatomy of a Great Deception. We've got a few episodes lined up that I'm very pumped about. These are some of the, for me, the most fascinating scientific analyses. And the one we've got today is by a man named Paul Bromley. In 1978, a group of scientists were put together in a program called STURP. It was a group of scientists from around the world, non-denominational. These weren't Christians or Catholics or atheists. They were from all spectrums. 33 on the initial team, and over the few years that this project was live, there were a few other scientists that chimed in. Forensic analysts, archaeologists, carbon dating, any institution or field of study covering anything that could potentially be relevant to analysis of this shroud, which I'm calling the Shroud of Turin. And something I do want to caution against, and I sometimes wonder if it's the reason that Moses' bones were hidden from Satan for some reason. Couple that with what God had said about worshiping heavenly images or to make any image of anything in heaven and along those lines. I think God wanted to avoid us worshiping things like shrines and shrouds and burial sites, for instance, because I think the plan is not worship an inanimate object, but instead have a relationship with the creator of the universe, which still sounds ridiculous for me to say, because I'm a person based in science. When scientists speak, it's my language. Paul Bromley was an American. He was recruited to be on the team that studied the Shroud. So we're gonna watch a presentation today from a scientist named Paul Bromley. It was from the mid-1980s, and by now the findings of STURP had been making their way into the media. I'm just going to give you two incredible findings. Now keep in mind, you might not be aware of this because the same news channels that told us what to believe about 9/11 are the same ones that put on documentaries of their version of what the Shroud is. I'm not saying that it is something that covered Jesus Christ. I'll give you a few nuggets. The scientists that studied this, two things that I think you'll find interesting. There's 100 of them. Here's just two. Number one, they identified that in the eyes of the image of the person, whoever it might have been, do I personally believe it was Jesus Christ? I do. Could I swear out in a court of law? No. Do I have reservations? I do. Do I believe Jesus is real? Absolutely. We're not talking about whether he's real or not. We're talking about whether this shroud at one time potentially covered his body. Two interesting things I want to leave you with before we let Paul Bromley take it over. In the course of the STURP investigation, so many things were discovered that for me are just fascinating. I'll leave you with two. Number one, they identified coins that were used to hold the eyelids down of whoever it was that was underneath this shroud. And the coins are traced back to between 29 and 36 AD. These were Roman coins. Second thing is I always used to think that the images on the shroud were made because they were bloodstains. Now, yes, there are bloodstains on the shroud. What I never knew is what the shroud is essentially it's a photograph. It is a radioactive image, meaning one scientist used the term a neutron explosion, burning the image of that body onto the shroud. Obviously, nuclear technology was not around in 29 to 36 AD, which now starts to put us in the supernatural category. The man that you're about to hear, when he went into this project, for what it is worth, lifelong scientist Paul Bromley, but like so many things, it doesn't matter how old you are, when you get touched, you get touched. It changed his life. I think you'll hear it in this presentation.
There's one thing I've got to say that's extremely important. Just that we understand each other. I cannot tell you who this man was, and neither can anyone else. Science is never going to be able to say that we can prove the name of the man that was once upon a time wrapped in the Shroud of Turin. Simply because science, by the very nature of the thing, is forced to deal only with facts. You can't make wild guesses. At least you're not supposed to. Everybody does. You only get excited when someone else does. But no matter how long you talk, and my record is somewhere between 6.5 and 7 consecutive hours. And I don't think I repeated myself once in that length of time. I'm not going to do it tonight, obviously. But you can't talk that long about the cloth. The information coded into it. the man that really was once upon a time wrapped in it. But if you're going to be honest, and that is the name of the game, sooner or later you have to say that nowhere in the cloth is there a name. Nowhere does it say this is a photograph of. I can't tell you who he was. There's no way that we can ever tell you that this or any other portrait is that of Jesus of Nazareth, simply because we do not know what Jesus looked like. We don't have his fingerprints, we don't have his blood type, we don't have his dental structure. We don't even have a good description of him. Painting and sculpture were forbidden to the Jews. It was against their religion. And for some reason that nobody really understands, none of Jesus' four biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, bothered to tell us what he looked like. All we know about Jesus from the Bible is that he was young. He was between 30 and 35, and he must have been built like a bull. He was a carpenter in the days before there were lumber yards. If Jesus wanted a board, he had to cut the tree down. If they had a little money in those days, they'd have a donkey to drag it into town. We can show even historically that Jesus was among the extreme poor. The best that he could ever have hoped to have done would be to cut that tree down to a size he could handle, put it across his shoulders, and carry it. He had to have been built like the lumberjack that he really was. But that's really all we know about him. So once again, there's no way that I can ever tell you that this was Jesus of Nazareth. But you should also know that the vast majority of court cases are not won on direct evidence. It's very seldom that anyone might come forward and say, he committed the murder. I watched him do it. I only know of one murder that was ever committed on television, although I did watch that one. But this is why we have police departments, detectives, to put a case together and pile up circumstantial evidence piece by piece by piece until the weight of that evidence is so great that it's impossible not to render a verdict. And that's what we're doing. If nothing more, the Shroud of Turin research project has become the biggest piece of scientific detective work that the world has ever seen. And tonight, here, you're the judge and you're the jury. And I'm not being cute. It's only a statement of fact. The only promise I'll make you this evening is that I'll tell you the truth. We'll give you facts and data, a little bit of what we've accumulated, and you do anything you want to do with it. Truthfully, I couldn't care less. They tell me that that's a horrible way to start a talk, but I've started a great many that way, because it's truth. I know what I believe today, but I really can't make anyone else agree with me. All I can do is what I did. Give you the information, a bit of what we've got, and then you decide, if you think you can, who was he? What if anything does he mean to you? The Shroud of Turin is a piece of linen cloth. It's 14 feet long, 3 feet 7 inches wide, and obviously carries on its surface the image of a crucified man. Without question, it's the most controversial thing that the Roman Catholic Church ever got their hands on. They never actually owned it until last October. The cloth has been privately owned since the 1400s by the House of Savoy. The ranking member in Savoy was Umberto, King of Italy, deposed, living in exile in Lisbon, Portugal. When he flew out of Turin one step ahead of death in the late 40s, he left the cloth behind in his private chapel. That chapel today is the Cathedral of Turin. It came under the protectorship of the Archbishop, and that's where the name came from. Turin was the ancestral home of the Savoys for centuries. Umberto died about a year and a half ago. Instead of giving the cloth to his daughter, as his ancestors had done, he willed it to the church. They finally got legal possession of it last October. But they never did make up their mind if this is really the cloth that Jesus was wrapped in for burial or not. They've actually fought wars over it. It wasn't until 1968 that Pope Paul authorized formation of a team of scientists, international in scope, to examine it and try to determine once and for all, genuine or bogus. The first time they ever gave a so-called relic to science. Some of us think that it's rather strange that no one ever called this team together. To the best of my knowledge, not one man or woman on it today was ever appointed to it. And yet today, for without question the first time in history, every discipline of science is involved to the utmost of expertise and technology, equipment and brains, on a non-military project. You couldn't stop this if you wanted to. Someone at the Air Force Academy has said that we used to think that the strangest thing in the universe were the black holes of space. Today, we know it's a 14-foot-long cloth over the altar in Turin. But that's your decision. The cloth turned up in 1352 in a two-bit little village in central France called Lirey, L-I-R-E-Y. I find I have to spell things occasionally. You might have guessed by now I'm a New Englander. Someday the rest of you people are going to learn to talk English like us. And obviously the first question to be answered when the team did come into existence was, if this thing really is the burial shroud of Jesus, what was it doing in France? Where was it for 13 centuries? The tracing was volunteered by a couple of men in England, Dr. John A.T. Robinson, Bishop of Woolwich, Anglican Church, Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a historian from Oxford named Ian Wilson. They volunteered to try to trace this using art and literature. It was Ian who discovered that every one of the masters, you name him, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Da Vinci, whoever, used that face for his model of Christ. That's why you think you recognize him. You've seen that face 1,000 times. One man has made Jesus an Italian, someone else a Frenchman, a Dutchman, a Greek, a woman. They've romanticized him. They've done everything imaginable to him. I think virtually everyone knows what Picasso did. But they've copied details which couldn't have been taken from anything in the world but this cloth. The conformity is true all the way back to the year 500. Prior to the year 500, there isn't any. And it makes sense. Once again, one painter gave Jesus the face of a 12-year-old kid. Someone else gave him a beard the color of mine. I've already said your guess is just as good as mine is what Jesus actually looked like. And yet, for some reason, it appears that the entire church, east and west, by the year 500, had reached the conclusion that this was the true likeness of Christ. Ian turned up a letter written by a Greek bishop, a man who lived and wrote around the year 300, 325, Eusebius of Caesarea, a prolific writer. He did a lot. But no church, no denomination has ever considered his work inspired. That is to say that nobody has ever thought that it was worthy of being in the Bible. But he does give us a tremendous picture of what life was like in the early church. Customs, traditions, stories, legends, that sort of thing. And that's where the poor devil got into trouble every time. Like me, he was a storyteller. Like me, they've called him a lot of names. They've said you couldn't believe a word he said. It was sci-fi. It was too far out. Who could ever believe Eusebius? For instance, he gives us the story of Abgar, who was king of Edessa, Turkey at the time of Christ. Abgar was dying of an incurable disease. He had heard of Jesus as a healer. So he sent a messenger, a soldier, from Edessa, at that time it was part of Syria, south into Palestine to ask Jesus to come north and heal him. We know that he never left the nation. Supposedly he told the soldier, "Go back and tell your king that I can't come, but I will send a disciple." Shortly after the ascension, the Apostle Thomas is supposed to have dispatched a disciple named Addai north into Turkey, carrying under his arm a cloth with an image on it. Abgar believed on Jesus. It did not say he believed in the cloth. For my own conscience sake, I've got to say this. I know of absolutely no reason why this cloth should be worshipped. I know that there are people who do. I've met a few. I think that they're extremely wrong. I know of no miracles attributed to it. I know of nothing that's ever happened to anyone by handling it. I know of no healings. You will not have a cancer healed by holding a photograph of the cloth over the body. I read that in the Pulp newspaper not long ago. They were selling photographs. Some people will do anything to make a buck. But I can't talk about lives turned 180 degrees around. And that might be the biggest miracle of them all. But to say that the Shroud is that kind of divine, at least personally, I can't buy it. Abgar believed on Jesus. Excuse me. He was healed of his disease. He led the city to the Lord. Edessa became the first Christian city in the world. Well, it's still there. Today it's known as Urfa in south-central Turkey. The Eastern Orthodox Church calls it a holy city. They claim that they date their Christianity back to the time of Christ. There have always been monks and hermits living in caves and tombs around the place just to be close to it. After Abgar died, his son Manu went back to the pagan gods. He proceeded to slaughter every Christian he could find. The cloth vanished. Apparently it was gone for about 200 years. Then somewhere around the year 300, there was a disastrous flood in south-central Turkey. Part of the city wall washed out. A rock fell out high above the west gate. There in a leather pouch or a bag was the cloth. Apparently somebody had bricked it into the city wall for safekeeping. It was worshipped. It was the prized relic of the entire church, to the extent that the emperor decided that it belonged to Byzantium. He sent an army to get it. It was easy. They were bigger. He welcomed the cloth to Constantinople. It hung there on the wall of a cathedral in what seems to have been a trellis-like frame until the year 1204. Now, there's really no way that we're going to ever prove this, but it does look rather good. Using X-ray fluorescence, we've been able to find every crease that anyone has ever placed in the cloth since the day it was woven, and refolded accordingly. If you follow one set of very deep-set creases, meaning that it had been folded that way for an awfully long time, 900 years, you get something like this: his head and shoulders, remarkably reminiscent of a mysterious relic that disappeared centuries ago, something that nobody in recorded history has ever seen, called the Mandelion. The face of Christ, which is supposed to have hung on the wall of a cathedral in Constantinople. We're not about to prove it, but it does look awfully good that the Shroud of Turin and the Mandelion were one and the same thing. 1204 was the year of the Fourth Crusade. That was the year that the Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople and sacked the city, stripping it. Ian found a letter written by a French crusader, writing home, "I have seen the Sidwan, the burial cloth of our Lord." Not much of a peg. Another letter, "The Sidwan has disappeared, and neither Frenchman nor Greek knows its whereabouts." And that's all. But they put together a case that'll hold water in virtually any court of law in the world. One of the armies sacking Constantinople were the Knights Templar, dealers in religious relics, unbelievably secretive. They wouldn't give you the time of day if they had any choice in the matter. Immensely wealthy. Without question, the wealthiest people in the world. They had built castles all over Europe and the Middle East just to house their money. Ultimately, this is what destroyed them. They were also perfectly capable of stealing anything they wanted if they wanted it badly enough. And it's perfectly easy to imagine a crusader finding the cloth hanging on the wall, literally ripping it off, shoved under a leather jerkin. It's on its way to France. Circumstantial. But around the year 1300, the Templars were in awfully big trouble. That money of theirs was driving the King of France right out of his mind. They had more than him. And somewhere there's an unwritten law that no one should have more money than the king. All he needed was half an excuse to get it. He got that excuse when the rumor went around France that the Templars were idolatrous. They were worshiping a face, the face of a bearded man on a cloth. I'm not certain that anyone has ever proven that the king made any real attempt to find it. He didn't want it, he didn't need it, he couldn't have cared less. He had what he wanted. He got the money, not without a good scrap, but he got it. He pulled a pre-dawn raid that would have made Hitler proud of him. Rounded up every Grand Master of the Templars, he burned them all alive at the stake for idolatry. Every man died protesting his innocence at least to idolatry, but he died. The last one to go up in the flames was a man named Geoffrey de Charnay, the first Earl of Chambray. Within a very few years after he died in the flames, the second Earl, also Geoffrey, placed the Shroud of Turin on public display. Since then, Roman Catholic record keeping is phenomenal. They can almost tell you the name of every individual who's even looked at this cloth for almost 700 years, proving beyond the point of argument, whatever this is, however that image came to be imprinted on it, it very definitely happened before 1352. Not too long ago, while renovating a castle in England, a place in Somerset called Templecombe, the home of the Knights Templar in England, found a board with his face on it, dating back to Templar days. They had it. However they may have gotten it, the Knights Templar had it. At the same time that John and Ian had been doing their thing in England, and they weren't alone. In Zurich, until he died about a year ago, was a botanist by the name of Max Fry. Possibly half of us here tonight are old enough to remember the name. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the world a while back. Max headed up the commission of criminologists that investigated Dag Hammarskjöld's death. That's what he was, a criminologist, working for the police departments all over Europe, special consultant to the UN, the kind of a man that would take a dust sampling off of your clothes, tell you where you went, what you did, and the other person's first name. He was positively dangerous. He saw a highly enhanced photograph of the cloth. He saw what he thought was pollen caught in the weave, and that was Max's field. Pollen, you probably know, is just as identifiable as your fingerprint. There are no two types of plants producing a pollen that's even slightly similar. If you find pollen, you know what kind of a plant it came from. If you know where that plant grows, you know where the object has been. It's that simple. We've got pollen caught in the weave of every item of clothing we have on tonight that's been exposed to the open air. It's microscopic, but you're not going to get it out by washing it or dry cleaning it. It's there. If you're smart, you keep it away from people like Max. They might tell you too much about yourself. It's almost a literal miracle that in '72, he asked for and he got permission to take a dust sampling off the cloth. He identified some 28 types of pollen in that first sample. It was no tremendous surprise to anybody that the first one he definitely tied down was a type of beech, growing exclusively in northern and central Europe. Big deal. The cloth turned up in France. He found pollen from plants that grow nowhere in the world but Italy. It's been in Torino since the 1400s. He found 8 types of pollen from plants that grow nowhere in the world but southern and central Turkey, in the area around Constantinople, proving that France is not where the cloth originated. And maybe, just maybe, Eusebius wasn't the bull artist they've been calling him for so many centuries. It could very well be that he knew exactly what he was writing about back in the year 300. Then Max turned up 9 types of pollen that couldn't be identified in any textbook on botany, and he was supposed to have owned them all. He said it's not unusual that there are a large number of unimportant, unclassified plants. He called it an educated guess. I can't copy the German accent. You go to where maybe the cloth was. A quick flight to Israel, a walking tour of Judea with his glass, and Max found what he wanted. I'm quoting him. Desert plants that grow nowhere in the world but southern Israel, in the area around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. In my professional opinion, at some time in its history, this cloth has been exposed to the open air in Italy, France, southern or central Turkey, and southern Israel, in the area around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. Since then, several more samplings, a lot more pollen. They fill in the gaps, they tie it all together a lot tighter. But then, sitting with his microscope in his living room in Zurich, he did what never crossed anybody's mind. It was strictly a bonus, a gift. Max had taken the cloth backward in time 1,000 years. He had found fossilized pollen from plants that had been known to be extinct since the early centuries. Again, showing rather conclusively that the cloth has got to be at least a full 1,000 years older than its own recorded history. While these men and women, there have been many, have been doing their thing all over Europe and the Middle East, in this country the work is scientific. I suppose that's because that's the way we think, that's where our money is, and that's where the people are that got drafted for the job. And there's no 2 people on this team ever get together in the world anymore without the question coming up almost immediately. Why now? Why us? You see, almost nobody wanted anything to do with it. In 1978, the mildest thing I called the Shroud of Turin was garbage. When Dr. Demihala called and asked me if I wanted to get involved with him in the work that was about to start, I asked Tom if his brain melted. Thought I was clever. He's a nuclear physicist. I said, "You're crazy. You've gone stark." He didn't think it was funny. He said, "You've gone stark raving mad. It couldn't possibly be real. Even if it is real, what's it good for?" Well, thank God Tom didn't listen to me. Maybe that's why he's a presidential advisor and I'm not. That's also spelled, if you didn't realize it, S-T-U-P-I-D. I'd made up my mind before I knew anything about it. Preconceived opinions, one of the dumbest things anyone can possibly do, to make a judgment before you know anything. But I did it, so I can't say anything. As I said, thank God they didn't listen to me. I came in on his coattails, kicking, screaming, and maybe even using a little Old Testament language. But I quickly found out that virtually everyone else agreed with me. With the exception of only a few men from Rome, really all anyone wanted to know was who did it and how. The how part is still extremely intriguing. One of the team gave an interview to the New York Times not long ago in which he said, and it was truth, that everyone went to Italy expecting to set up their equipment, work for 15 minutes, pack up the equipment, and come back home. Today, the burden of proof is on the skeptic. That, too, is truth. Nobody funded us. We didn't get any money from the church. None of the trust came through with anything substantial worth talking about. I started doing what I'm doing tonight almost 6 years ago. But he said, this is worth anything. We'll never in our life do anything bigger than this. He'd been in the Mariner space program, putting the team on the moon. He still thinks this is bigger. I do too. The labs, you all know them. Los Alamos Scientific, the world's biggest. They made the A-bomb. Pasadena Jet Propulsion, JPL. They're giving us the pictures coming back from Saturn, Jupiter, the spacecraft. The Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs. The Air Force Weapons Lab at Albuquerque. Brooks Institute of Photography, McCone Associates, Brookhaven National, half the universities. There's a paradox involved. It means absolutely nothing. But I think you have to admit it's a little bit different. Virtually every man and woman involved in this project is involved, one way or the other, in the development, the assembly, or the distribution of the bomb, working on the Shroud of the Prince of Peace. As I said, it doesn't mean a thing, but it is a little weird. Those labs are merely where the people are working tonight. I'm talking, they're working. The military is not financing this, neither is the federal government. But I've said it on many a campus and overseas, I'm not the least little bit ashamed to be an American. Where else in the world could something like this happen? That we have the use of the most sophisticated equipment that the world has, assuming Russia doesn't have something better, and we doubt it, on a non-priority basis. That merely means that if the military isn't using a certain piece of equipment tonight, you can almost guarantee that someone on this team has it. Just do it on your own time, pay your own way, and for God's sakes, don't use military stationery. Where else but the States? I can't begin to tell you what they found. There simply aren't enough hours tonight. All I can do is give you an extremely quick overlook, something that might interest you. As early as 1898, an Italian attorney by the name of Pia took the first photograph of the cloth. He wrote that he almost fell out of his window when he developed his plate, because what should have been a negative turned out to be what we have here, a positive, proving that he had photographed a negative. Every time you take a picture, your new negative is the reverse of what you were looking at. Black becomes white, white is black. If he had a positive, he must have photographed a negative. Over the centuries, the image on the cloth had been described as vague, weak, indistinct, ephemeral, weird, made with unworldly colors. I'll buy the weird. It's only because light and shade are reversed. Black is white, white is black. More than 500 years before photography, the first photographic negative was not printed until 1857. This turned up in 1352. More than 500 years before photography, something had imprinted a photographic negative on a piece of linen cloth. When this team went to Italy in October of '78, over 50,000 photographs were taken. If you took a deep breath, somebody took a picture of it to record it. The pictures are a lot better than his, but all that anyone has proven is that Pia is right. The image is still a photographic negative. Mid-'70s, Air Force Weapons Lab, Albuquerque. A couple of teachers from the academy, John Jackson, Eric Jumper. Both of them had their doctorates, spatial physics, spatial engineering, captain, major, Mariner space program, using some semi-secure equipment, a VP-8 image analyzer. The thing had been developed to map the surface of Mars and for military surveillance. One night, John took a slide of his face, put it under the camera, projected it through the equipment, closed-circuit television, and both men have said many times they know exactly the way Pia felt when he developed his plate, because they almost literally got blown out of their chairs when the image came out three-dimensional. We don't know how to do that to anything. Science simply hasn't progressed that far. We know how to put it in, but we haven't learned, I beg your pardon, we know how to decode it, but we have yet to learn how to put it into anything, let alone a piece of linen cloth. They took their equipment and their technique down to JPL. They scanned this frontal image, the same way a TV picture is produced. Scan a line, jump, scan a line, jump. The computer began to produce strips, bearing the configuration, the outline, the shape of the man in the cloth. John and Eric's wives and some other girls sat down with cardboard boxes and razor blades, traced the outlines out and cut them out. The girls have put together what, without any question, is the world's craziest jigsaw puzzle. 560 some pieces of cardboard. Assembled vertically, the computer had produced a three-dimensional image, you can call it a statue, of a man 5 feet 8 inches tall, mutilated almost beyond belief. And there's no other photograph on Earth that you can do this with. At the very least, what we have here is the world's oldest and the world's strangest photograph. You see, that's why the work must go on. There simply are no real answers. The man in the shroud has no eyes. I suppose you'd say, as I did, that they were closed in death. That's what I thought. Some people think he's staring at them. But it was a mind bender in '78 when JPL enhanced the face to the degree that you could see that where the eyes should be are a pair of circular blank spots, button-like objects. Until one of the archaeologists came up with the information that it was the custom of first-century Jews to put a pebble on the eyes of a dead man, to weight the lid shut until rigor mortis set in, to keep them from popping open. If they were wealthy, they might use a coin. These were approximately the size of a first-century coin. Joseph of Arimathea was wealthy. We know that he had money on his person. He had just purchased a piece of cloth with which to bury Jesus. Would he be willing to provide a couple of coins? Your guess is just as good as mine is. The team took an extremely sensitive camera to Italy, the same thing the astronauts have been carrying around the moon. Two of the bigger labs in this country each gave us $1 million worth of specially made film for the work. We'd become professional beggars, too. But it worked. And photographed the eyes. I double-talked it for over 2 years, trying to say it but not say it. I was itching. But now that Father Philos of Loyola has published his book, it amounts to a small paper, his paper I should say, it amounts to a small book copyrighted. I can quote him. He died just a short time ago, too, a month or so ago. We've got a rather high death rate in this project. But it's going to be controversial for a while to come. But now that Virginia Polytech is part of the picture, it might not take that long. You see, there are men who are going to tell you there's nothing there, simply because it's impossible to explain it. Why can you see the coins in the first place? There's no answer. Stranger yet, how can you read the markings? No answer. Why do they appear in some types of photography? In other types, there's nothing there. If there really were something there, you should be able to see it no matter what kind of film you're using. But that isn't the case. Yet there is something there. I couldn't possibly make it up. I've never seen a Judean lepton in my life before. I wouldn't know what to conjure up. You can't call it self-hypnosis. Yet we can read 7 out of 10 letters in sequence in the middle of the 2 words Tiberius Caesar. That's what it is, a Judean lepton, minted by a character named Pontius Pilate. The Bible refers to it as the widow's mite, the smallest coin ever minted in Israel. We found 3 of them in a museum down in East Point, Georgia. They look as if they've been cut out of a piece of bronze with a pair of tin snips. But the important thing is that depending on which numismatist, which coin expert you happen to be talking to, this particular lepton was in circulation for a maximum of either 3 years or 7 years. Take your choice. One man says 3, the other 7. But that only means that if whoever put those coins in his eyes was using a coin that was currently circulable, a coin that he could spend in the store, the man in the shroud, whoever he might have been, appears to have died within a 7-year maximum of the 12th year of Tiberius Caesar. That's our AD 29. He died between the year 29 and 36, possibly between the year 29 and 32. How much closer would you like to try to get it? Let me tell you about the man. Once again, there is no name on the cloth. This work was done at Los Angeles Forensic by Dr. Bob Buckland. They have the rather dubious distinction of being the world's busiest. They get more corpses per hour than any other lab in the world. They know dead men. Philadelphia Forensic, Dr. John Gambicia. What I'm about to say is documented. The man in the shroud was a Jewish person. He was between 30 and 35 years old. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed approximately 155 pounds. He took one of the worst beatings the doctors have ever known a man to take and walk away from it. This is the dorsal image. It's his back. You have his head, shoulders, buttocks, legs. His feet are at the bottom. All the white on the image itself is blood. The frontal image likewise. All of the white is blood. It is not a photograph of blood. It is blood. Proven in the laboratory 12 different ways. 2 of them are acceptable in any court of law in any nation in the world today to prove the presence of blood in an object. The man in the shroud took in excess of 120 strokes of a 3-pronged Roman flagrum. A flagrum? A short leather whip. Lashes about this long. 3 of them. 2 balls of lead on the end of each lash. They were either sharpened or they had spikes in them. Meat was ripped out of his body with every flick of the lash. He was scourged nude, bent over double and tied to either a ring in the floor or a short post, so that his back was like a tabletop. They could do what they wanted to do to him. He was scourged by 2 men standing on opposite sides. The man on the right was a little bit bigger than the man on the left, and a lot more sadistic. He enjoyed his work. He overlapped his strokes. He curved them around to get the front of the body. There isn't an inch of his body, front or back, and we can see every inch with X-ray fluorescence, that does not bear scourge marks. They picked the most sensitive areas to cut him to shreds. The only place they missed is the pericardium, the area immediately above the heart. The doctors say if he had taken that kind of a beating over the heart, he would have died under the lash, which means that this one had to have been done by experts. They were pros. It was not the first time that they had ever brought a man to a second or 2 before death and then stopped. They knew how to make it hurt the most and last the longest. When one more stroke of the lash would undoubtedly have killed him, the beating stopped. The man in the shroud wore a cap of thorns. Not a circlet, the way we've always envisaged Jesus wearing, but what appears to have been a complete cap. His entire head is covered with puncture wounds, made by a small, extremely sharp and pointed object, such as the thorn. To me, it makes a great deal more sense. I find it very difficult to imagine anybody that would give a man a beating like that, taking time out like a preschooler to make a daisy chain. For me, at least, it's a great deal easier to imagine someone getting a sadistic idea. He says he's a king. He needs a crowd. Grabbing his sword, running out the back of the Fortress Antonia, cutting off a thorn bush. Eastern thorns, of course, are that long. Possibly grabbing a handful from the fire, quickly twisting them into a knot or a ball, maybe tying a rope around it, jamming it down to his eyebrows. Something like that was done to him. The man in the shroud carried a heavy object tied on his shoulders after the beating, something that weighed between 70 and 100 pounds. He has no flesh left on his shoulder blades. The wounds have been rubbed together. The flesh is chafed off. Undoubtedly, this would be the cross piece of the cross. Contrary to paintings and sculpture, such as the Way of the Cross, There really is no record that the Romans ever made anyone drag the entire thing. At least normally, if there is such a word, they would tie the crosspiece on in the position of crucifixion. Then they would march the victim through the streets to the site of the execution, always taking the longest possible route, wandering up one street and down the next one. The entire idea was to deter future crime, to keep you from doing whatever it was this poor devil did. They wanted the greatest number of people possible to see him dying. The records say that they would have a leash around his ankle, a strip of leather like a dog, to keep them from running away. They also say it was considered fun to pull their legs out from under them with their arms tied in this position. The man in the shroud has the end of his nose gone, with dirt ground into it from a bad fall. He has no skin left on his left knee, with dirt in it. He took at least 2 major falls. Someone worked him over rather badly. He was belted in the face more than once. He's got a shiner that's a real beauty. He appears to have a broken nose, but he has no broken bones. The nose is cartilage. There appears to be a separation in the cartilage. It's almost as if someone might possibly have taken a club and hit him sideways across the face. Someone grabbed his beard, ripped it out. His beard was plucked. They had a great deal of fun with him. This is not a photograph. It was done with a computer. Neither is it color accurate. It isn't intended to be. The idea was to determine how much blood was visible in his face. Using the big computer, they've subtracted everything in the face except the blood. There is nothing visible in this picture except blood. They certainly didn't leave very much of him, did they? To me, if nobody else, that's Isaiah 53. He was mutilated beyond that of any other man. At the very least, this is undoubtedly what you would have seen if you'd seen him hanging on the cross. The man in the shroud was crucified. Once again, not the way we've always imagined Jesus being crucified, through the palm, but through the wrist. Probably the simplest thing I've ever known of anyone to do in shroud-related work. Someone obtained a cadaver, the body of a man. They took his arm off at the shoulder and nailed it to the wall with a 10-penny nail through the palm, then sat and watched it for a couple of hours. In something less than 2 hours, the bones in the palm separated, the nail ripped through, the arm fell. Simple conclusion, a nail through the palm will not support the dead weight of a man's arm, let alone a body in the throes of death agony. But we have a small space in our wrist, just below the heel of the hand. Ironically, the size of a square-cut nail. A couple of these little toys driven through there will hold any amount of weight. If you've never seen one before, it's a crucifixion nail. Cute, aren't they? A pair of them driven through the wrist will hold anything. It does not conflict with Scripture. I realize that depending on which translation of the Bible you might own, the Gospel of John uses the word hand, or palm, for the point through which a nail was driven through Christ's body. But the Greeks have got at least 3 words for everything. It was a native-born Greek pastor that said this. I took this to Pastor Zekas. If this were the 1st century, he'd be a bishop. He's in his mid-80s. He's still servicing 9 churches on foot and with a donkey. He's got scars on his body to prove what he believes. He's been stoned for his faith more than once. He laughed at me. He said, Paul, you Yankees are all alike. You're just never going to get it through your thick, stupid Yankee heads that we Greeks have got 3 words for everything. And he's right. If any of you are Greek, I've got to ask you forgiveness in advance. I know what my pronunciation is. I've had Greeks scream in agony when they heard me try, but it's the best I can do. There's the word pamera, which covers this part of the body. It was not used in the New Testament. The word that was used is chire, C-H-I-E-R. It covers this part of your body. You can translate it finger, palm, wrist, forearm, elbow. Take your choice. About 400 years before Christ, at the command of Caesar, 70 rabbis were ordered from Jerusalem down to Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. You can still purchase that book. There's probably a copy in the pastor's library. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Scripture. The word chire, same word, used many times. Somewhere in Chronicles, one of the kings wore a ring on his. It refers to the joints of the chire. And in Genesis 24, Eliezer, Abraham's servant, was ordered north into Syria to purchase a wife for Isaac. He gave Rebekah gold bangles, bracelets. She put them on her chire. Where do you girls wear your bracelets? It's identically the same word. Our only problem was that until 1979, we did not know how to crucify anyone. Everything that we've ever taught or been taught on the subject has been based on the imagination of writers and artists over the centuries who've tried to put a story together with virtually no information. You see, Constantine outlawed crucifixion in the year 315. There hasn't been a recorded one since. We simply forgot how to crucify someone. Maybe we should forget it again? And then again, maybe it's doggone near time the church found out what a crucifixion is? You're never going to forget it. We throw the word around awfully loosely once or twice a year. We get maudlin about it. We sing about it. You know, the old rugged cross? And nobody had the faintest idea of how to do one. We had to learn. One of the doctors, older than I am, had himself crucified. Not one of those freaky things that you read about occasionally in the spring. He was tied on a cross. It was done under supervision. He was jacked up so that he could find out firsthand as a medical doctor what would happen to his own organs. He couldn't think of any other way to do it. He only lasted for seconds. They had to put an axe to it and take him down. The other one used skeletons. Today we could crucify someone and make it work. The only place that would work is the wrist. It does not conflict with the original language. And I'm assuming that most of you know, but I'll say it anyway, that the New Testament was originally written in Greek. There has always been an international language. Today it's American. If you can go anywhere in the world you wish today, and if you speak our brand of English, American East, you're not going to have a problem. It's a mandatory subject in Europe from the 4th grade up. The kids in the 7th and 8th grade speak more proper English really than we do. It's the language of business and culture. All the airlines operate in American once they're in the air. In the 1st century, that international language was Greek. Anyone with any kind of an education at all spoke it. Apparently, the writers of the New Testament intended that their work could be read in every language, in every nation in the known world. They wrote their letters and their work in the international language. Our problem is merely to interpret it, or to translate it. This does not conflict with the Greek. They used 2 nails in his feet. They put one foot flat against the upright, the way we've always imagined it. They drove a nail in diagonally, just below his ankle. It came out through his heel. They put the other foot on top of it and nailed the 2 of them together, lower down, through the instep. He ended up by taking 2 nails through one foot and 1 through the other. Loads of fun. But Dr. Gambisi proved with skeletons that that's the only way it could be done and make it work. If they'd used a single nail the way we've always imagined it, the way the artists have shown it, the victim would have thrown his weight against it only once to push himself up and breathe. He would never do it the second time. Like the palm, the bones would have separated. It would have been over much too quickly to make the Romans happy. And this was intended to be the ultimate death. It wasn't. It came awfully close to it. The man in the shroud has an elliptical wound of about 4 centimeters between the 5th and 6th rib on the right. Is it a coincidence that 4 centimeters is the size of a Roman lance head? Whatever made it, lance, spear, javelin, penetrated diagonally upward and it went to his heart. A huge amount of blood that could only have come from the heart, as well as a thin watery substance, more water than blood, flowed out of the wound, separated, flowed across his back. The doctors say it proves 2 things. The man in the shroud did not die the usual crucifixion death of suffocation. Neither, of course, did he die of crura fracture, smashing the bones of his thighs with a club so that he couldn't push himself up to breathe. He died of cardiac arrest. His heart just stopped, for whatever reason. He was dead before the weapon went in. Who does it sound like? We had to do what I honestly don't believe has ever been done before. We had to look at the Bible in a totally unique manner. Tom DeMahala woke up in Italy one night in a cold sweat, rolled off of his cot, grabbed the clipboard, started to run. The one thing that nobody had thought to choreograph before the team left the States. His thought, what if everybody but him turned out to be a Roman Catholic? Seriously, can you see the headlines? Bias, prejudice. They made up their mind before they left the States. The team actually turned out to have been about 20% Roman Catholic, every mainline Protestant denomination, some non-mainline, Mormons and Orthodox Jews. But many said that that's only the way they were brought up as kids. In actuality, they were agnostic. Maybe God's real, maybe he's not, who knows, who cares, we don't need him anyway. An agnostic. But we have to look at the Bible not as atheists or agnostics or cynics or skeptics, not even as believers. The 2 or 3 of us that might have had the guts in '78 to stand up in public and say that we were believers had to be the devil's advocates. We had to look at the Bible strictly as research people. That's what I mean unique. This may truly be the first time in 2,000 years that anyone has ever gotten into that book without trying to prove something. And we weren't trying to prove a thing. We were not trying to prove it right, nor were we trying to prove it wrong. We couldn't have cared less. All we wanted were the answers to a couple of questions that in 1978 seemed to be good ones. Still do. Does that book say anything about a cloth with an image on it, or the mechanism that might have produced the image? Because I think you would believe that if this thing were really around in the first century, somebody should have recorded it. And yet on the surface, that's not the case. We had to take the entire crucifixion resurrection story apart, almost a word at a time, in the original languages, only looking for answers to our own questions. Go back as far as we possibly could, read everything we could find. Philo, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Flavius Rigidus Renatus, the entire Jewish Talmud. There's a beauty for you. I'm not sure I really recommend it, but it's an experience reading it. 18,000 pages of Jewish law that jumps from one subject to the other on every single page, and there's no index. Guess who got that job? Oy vey. And that's a good Jewish term that means exactly that, oy vey. I've got the greatest collection of useful information you could ever ask for. I could tell you how to kosher meat, hang on a phylactery, burn a girl who's been caught in adultery, or bury somebody according to first century Jewish law. But you see, facts, truth, is the name of the game. Tradition is worthless. I know there are people here tonight that would disagree with that totally. But tradition cannot be trusted. More times than not, it's been proven to be a daydream, we'll say. You've got to get truth. You've got to get facts. No matter how long it takes, no matter how much it costs. Truth is really the name of the game. Even if it meant reading 18,000 pages word by word, and it did. But we had to start at the very beginning with a mysterious character who comes out of the woodwork a few hours after Jesus died. Mysterious in the sense that he's totally unheard of before, but awfully important to us. Because all four biographers of Jesus tell us, and if you don't know it, you should, that if any 3 or 4 of us were to walk up into the road tonight and witness an automobile accident, if we each did an article on it, if our stories were to agree, and anyone cared enough to read them, then by the laws of external evidence, what we've written is history. 3 or 4 people witness a current event, they agree, they record it, they agree, it's historical fact. All 4 biographers of Jesus tell us that Joseph of Arimathea showed up in Jerusalem a few hours after Jesus died, carrying under his arm what you girls would call a length of piece goods. A piece of cloth that could be used to make a coat, a robe, a jacket, or bury somebody in it. It's usually translated shroud, and that's not a bad translation. We still know very little about Joe. Arimathea is nothing but a bump on top of a hill a few miles north of Jerusalem. He was wealthy. He was a rabbi. He was in politics because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. He had the title of Counselor of Israel. That's where we stopped. In ancient Israel, there had only been 14 counselors. They had to be members of the Sanhedrin, yes, but it went far beyond that. If anything were to have happened to the high priest of Israel to cause him to be incapacitated in any way whatsoever, it would be one of those 14 counselors that took his place. That means that that night, as the old man was hustling across the streets of old Jerusalem, the shadows lengthening around him, a bolt of cloth under his arm, his life in his hands, every Jewish person that recognized him bowed before him. This was the elite, the aristocracy of Israel. One of the 15 most important men in the entire nation come to get the body of Jesus. With him was a man even older than he was. I doubt very much that there's anybody in this room tonight who's given any serious consideration to where you're going to be buried. I think you have to be a certain age before you worry about that foolishness. I couldn't care less. Joe had already had his grave dug. He was not a kid. Nicodemus was probably older than he was. Wealthy, rabbi, Sanhedrin, teacher of Israel. That was no small title in the first century. And gutsy. 2 of the gutsiest men that we've ever read about. One writer, Mark, said that they had to screw up their courage before they went to Pilate, the Roman governor of Israel, to ask for the body of Jesus. I've got money that says they did. Their knees must have been knocking together like tambourines when they walked into the praetorium that night, the governor's palace, because for practical purposes they had committed suicide. Pilate turned out to have been something less than a human being. He was an animal, a beast. He's a man that did that to women and kids, loads of them. He made an unbelievable number of dead people. He was one of the very few Roman governors from anywhere that was ever recalled to Rome for excessive brutality. And that wasn't excessive brutality. That's only what you did to a non-Roman. The penalty for scourging a Roman citizen was execution. There was no law to protect the non-Roman. You could do anything you wanted to do to them. Pilate did that to babies. Ultimately, the Emperor Gaius ordered him home, found him guilty of excessive brutality, and suggested that it might be nice if he fell on his own sword and committed suicide. If he didn't do it, the legion could help him. Eusebius tells us how he did it. Philo wrote his book around the year 50 down in Alexandria. He described Pilate as a man of a stubborn, obnoxious, hateful, rebellious, spiteful disposition. He had nothing good to say about him. A man whose governorship was characterized by briberies, extortions, executions without trial beyond number. An absolutely lovable individual who wouldn't have thought twice about crucifying two old men on the next two crosses going up. Because that night, when they asked for the body of Jesus, in effect, they were really saying that they were either relatives or family, followers, disciples, believers, anything you might want to call them, in a man that Pilate had just had put to death as an enemy of the state. In other words, they were saying that they were enemies of the state. Of course, their knees were knocking together. Who wouldn't be? Fortunately for them, Pilate was more interested in the fact that Joe was trying to say Jesus was dead. And he knew better. He knew that nobody died in 6 hours on any cross. It couldn't possibly have been over 8 or 9 hours since Jesus had stood in front of him. He had condemned it to death, allowing for the time that it takes to actually walk across Old Jerusalem, crucify someone. Jesus couldn't possibly have been hanging on the cross for much over the 6 hours that John said he was. And here's Joe trying to say he's dead? Pilate would never buy that one. And I can't really blame him. You see, the shortest recorded crucifixion that we could find took 36 hours, dying by inches. The longest recorded crucifixion we could find took 9 days. The vast majority of crosses, I believe that includes his, were not raised above the ground. It was too much work. The victim would be crucified lying down, then the cross propped up. His feet would wind up no higher above the ground than the chairs you're sitting in. Lions and hyenas were a real thing in first century Israel. The hyenas are still there. The records indicate that many a man and woman hung there, watched the animal come, and they were eaten alive from their feet up while they hung there like a slab of beef. Vultures sitting on their shoulders, pecking their eyes out while they lived. And no, I'm not trying to make anyone sick. I haven't told you all of it. I'm merely glossing over it. You see, this was life in the first century. We'd forgotten it. Pilate saw it every day in the week. He was not about to believe that a man with a chest capacity like that one would die in 6 hours on any cross. That's why he sent for the officer that was in charge of the execution detail, a centurion, the commander of 100 men. We'd call him a captain. It wasn't until that Roman officer could swear an oath to his own commander. Sure, he's dead. I put a spear in him myself just to make sure, or words to that effect, that Pilate would sign the chit that gave Joe permission to take the body off the cross. You can almost read the old man's sigh of relief. We're going to live a little longer. They took off running. In context, nothing else makes sense, because Luke uses a strange term in the Greek. It means that it was the time of the lighting of candles. The stars were beginning to come out. It was the eve of the high holiday, the Passover, the high Sabbath, the second most important day in the Jewish year. And the Jewish day starts at sundown, not sunrise. Based on that term, the time of the lighting of candles, those two old men had something less than an hour in which to live. You see, the penalty for working on any Sabbath was execution. The Jews put you in a rock pile and threw rocks at you until someone broke your head. They called it stoning, the Jewish method of doing it. This was the Roman method. Those two old men didn't have much chance of surviving if they got caught working on the high Sabbath. With Jesus' body, he was altogether too controversial then as well as today. Besides, they were already criminals under one law. Their own Sanhedrin had recently passed a law that said that anyone who admitted to being a follower or a disciple of the carpenter from Nazareth would be excommunicated. Now that gets virtually no one very excited today. But in first century Israel, it was a different story. Excommunication meant certainly you lost most of your temple privileges, but it went far beyond that. No one could knowingly by law walk within 6 feet of you on the street. You were denied the use of the bath. You were denied the use of the razor. You could not be taught in the presence of anyone else. Your testimony was worthless in any court of law. You couldn't hire nor could you be hired in Israel. You couldn't hold a job. You could neither buy nor sell beyond the absolute necessities of life, which the law interpreted to be bread and water. This means that whatever those two old men had been an hour earlier, suddenly they'd become awfully poor men. What good is your money? no matter how much you might have, if you can't purchase something with it. All they could buy was bread and water. Their property automatically reverted to the state. Their wives had no rights. They had sold it all down the tube to take a body off a cross. I don't know what they believed, but boy, they believed something. They disappear from history. There isn't even a believable legend about either one of them. There's a couple legends about Joe, but frankly, your imagination has to be better than mine to accept them. There doesn't seem to be anything on Nicodemus. It's almost as if they've been created to bury someone and disappear. Like a few kings I read about, but that's getting philosophical. At that moment of time, they were sweating. All four writers, that makes it historical evidence, tell us something that gets extremely important, that the women watched everything that took place. One writer names four girls: Mary from the village of Magdala, Mary the Magdalene, the other Mary, probably the wife of Clopas, the mother of John Mark. Without question, this was Jesus' own aunt, his mother's older sister. It was common enough in the first century to give two girls in the same family the same name: Mary Beth, Mary Jane, that sort of thing. Many instances of it in literature. A woman named Salome, and his mother was there. John said also the other women who came up with him out of Galilee. So that means historically that there were at least 3 or 4 women, probably Moa, who watched everything that took place. As I said, that gets extremely serious. Now, I cannot prove this, but I refuse to believe that those 4 women sat on a rock and crocheted while 2 old men worked their heads off, simply because I haven't met any 4 women that would do that yet. Besides, if they were there, got caught there one moment after sundown, they too were Sabbath breakers, and the penalty was death. And they'd have been caught, no question. You see, the high priest and the Pharisees were watching everything that took place that night. How could they possibly have gone to Pilate the next morning, at least 12 hours in the future, and pointed out the exact tomb Jesus' body was in? How did they know where he was buried if they hadn't been there the night before watching everything? Is it too much to stretch your imaginations just a little bit and visualize that little burial party throwing one eye over their shoulder at the sun to see how much longer they've got left to live, the other eye at that group in the distance waiting for their bones? They were sweating, and the girls must have helped. There was altogether too much work to be done. A cross had to be lowered, the nails pulled out of the body. There are some 30-odd steps involved in burying a man under Jewish law, both then and today. It begins by very formally addressing him by his Hebrew name and that of his father, Yeshua ben David, Jesus the son of David. We ask your forgiveness for any indignity we may inflict upon your body in the process of preparing you for burial. It ends by kissing his lips with love. Somehow they get that out of Genesis 50. The work is done by women. In between, he is to be washed, shaven, his hair cut, his beard trimmed, his fingernails clipped and cleaned. You couldn't just wash him. You had to dig a pit, use a special washing board. You couldn't use cool water, let alone cold. It had to be warm, fragrant, aromatic, spiced. Ultimately, he would be anointed in fragrant spices and oils in liquid form, clothed and wrapped in a sheet. A tremendous amount of work. By now, considerably less than an hour in which to do it. Again, the women must have helped. The cross was lowered, the nails pulled out of the body. They did at least as much as they had to do to preserve it. They wrapped him in a sheet. Using the Greek, Matthew and Luke say that Jesus was folded into the cloth. This one was stretched out flat. He was laid on his back on half of it. The other half was brought over his head and draped over the front. If that's not folded, somebody tell me what it is. Mark said he was wrapped. I don't see any conflict. John said he was bound. This cloth was tied around the ankles, again around the waist, by cords probably made of rushes. He wound up being wrapped, folded, and bound into the cloth, all at the same time. No conflict. They laid him in a particular tomb. Matthew said it was Joe's own tomb. As far as I'm concerned, that's immaterial. Personally, I think they might have used Pilate's tomb if it was any closer, and they thought they could have gotten away with it, because they were moving. Nicodemus' contribution, 100 pounds Roman weight, 70 pounds our weight of myrrh and aloes. Why? It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. It's contradictory. You see, the Jews have never mummified a body, ever. The Jews have never embalmed a body if they could possibly help it. The Jews have never used winding strips. Sorry, kids, that's Christian tradition. The Bible does not say that Jesus was buried like a mummy. John was quite emphatic. Jesus was buried according to the manner and the custom of the Jews. And all the Jews have ever done, then or today, when the law permitted it, was to put a man in a sheet and bury him before sundown the same day. It was an Orthodox rabbi back in Connecticut that told me they would be doing it there if the law permitted it. They want the body to go back to dust as rapidly as possible. So why myrrh and aloes? That's why we had to read the Talmud. We had to get facts. About 2/3 of the way through that collection of holy law, we came across a rather obscure little tractate called the Eber Abathi, Jewish Burial Customs. This is almost verbatim. In ancient times, it was the custom to bury someone who had died of bowel trouble with spices and ointments placed next to the body. But because this was an embarrassment to the living, who were suffering from the same disease even while they lived, it became the custom, then afterwards it was enacted, it became law, to put spices and ointments next to the body of every dead person, so that there would never be any embarrassment to the living. All Nicodemus was doing was obeying his own law that called for spices and ointments to kill the smell of a decaying body. Several other references in the Talmud to the spices being used as a deodorant. If you wish to argue, think back to the story of Lazarus. He was a wealthy Jew. When he died, society people from Jerusalem came down to Bethany to help his sisters Mary and Martha mourn. Both accounts of the story clearly reveal that they loved their brother with a passion, and that they had the money and they had the desire to give their brother the best funeral that first century Israel could afford to give to anybody. If it really had been the custom to bury a man like a mummy, with 100 pounds of concrete or something in the folds, they'd have done it. But if they had, when Jesus stood outside that tomb and yelled, "Hey, Laz, come on out," look it up. Nobody went in and got him. Nobody carried him out. It says that although he was bound hand and foot, he sat up, stood up, and he walked out. And there's nobody in this room older than the preschoolers that would probably that would believe that a mummy can walk. You either have to be a small child or a horror story freak to buy that one. But in this game, you try anything. I did. Try getting out of bed tonight with your knees held together. You're going to find out that it doesn't work. A mummy can't sit up, he can't stand up, and he can't walk. But Lazarus did all those things. The only possible answer is that he must have been able to shuffle one foot in front of the other. He could only have been buried according to the manner and the custom of the Jews, in a sheet. We just never looked it up before. And when you get down to the bottom line, what difference does it make? Unless, of course, you happen to be trying to witness to a Jew in Jerusalem, and you tell them that Jesus was Jewish and they buried him like an Egyptian. You know what happens? You get laughed at. I wonder how many Jews we've turned off over the centuries because we were too lazy to do our homework. That too says something, but I don't like it, even a tiny little bit. Truth is the name of the game. The two old men rolled a stone across the face of the tomb. The Greek term, sportomegapetra, literally translated a very, 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 very great stone. Josh McDowell says a better translation is, "Hey, wow, man, get a load of that rock." That's not a bad translation either. But the Greek seems to indicate a stone weighing in excess of 1.5 tons. And it would be perfectly easy for two old men to do it, because Jewish burial tombs are nothing but caves, or holes dug into the side of a hill. A large stone will be placed above the entrance. If it's a wealthy tomb like the Garden Tomb, there might be something like a millstone rolling in a deep slot or a track. More often than not, it's just a big boulder. After the body's been interred, the men in the burial party put their back against it and start it rolling. Gravity drops it into place. But to open it would mean that you would have to roll at least 1.5 tons uphill with no power equipment. Those girls had an awfully good question on Sunday morning. There was absolutely nothing rhetorical about it. They meant it. Who's going to roll the stone away? It would have taken every man they knew in Jerusalem pushing together to do the job. The Codex Bezae may be the oldest piece of manuscript still in existence. It's in the Cambridge Library in England. It goes back to the first half of the 2nd century. The copier is obviously copying from a 1st century manuscript. In a gloss, that's a note in the margin that you can never copy off into the text. He says that the stone was of a size that 20 men pushing together could not have moved. There was no pebble. The girls had a good question. But a better question might have been, what were they doing there? If those good Jewish girls had actually been there on Friday night and they watched Jesus being buried, I think they helped. Why did they go home, waste their high holiday, their time, their money, purchasing more spices and ointments, preparing them, and now they're coming back to bury Jesus all over again? Hey, seriously, how many times do you bury a man in 3 days? It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's contradictory. Unless possibly they had done on Friday night what I've done, and so has every one of you at some point. So there's no way we can finish this job tonight. We'll do what we can tonight and finish it in the morning. Or in this case, let's do what we have to preserve his body and get out of here while our heads are still on our shoulders. If we're still alive, we'll be back on Sunday. The Encyclopedia Judaica, printed in Jerusalem, 1972 edition, a good encyclopedia, the same thing as the Britannica or the Americana, under the heading of burial, says it's obvious only to the Jews. It's obvious from the account of the burial of Jesus of Nazareth that there was no time on Friday night in which to bury him according to the requirements of the law. The burial party apparently did only as much as they had to do to protect the body. They intended to give him a legal burial on Sunday. The Jews saw it. Very few, if any, Christians ever bothered to look. At this point, there's a gap in the historical record of the crucifixion. I never saw it before. I never heard anyone preach it. That 3 out of 4 writers don't tell us what happened for the next 3 days. They end the story on Friday night with 2 old men rolling a big boulder. They drop the story and they don't pick it up again until Sunday, when the women are wondering how they're going to get past it. In between, there's nothing. Probably they didn't know. No one but Matthew gives us any indication at all of what could have happened. And nobody in the world but Matt could have written the 28th chapter of his book, because he turned out to have been a thief. He was a traitor. He was a man who had loved money more than he loved anything else in the world, including his own life. Matthew had been a tax collector. Well, over the years, back home, I've called tax collectors worse names than that, and I probably will again next week. But this one earned it. Israel then, and it usually was, a conquered nation. This time it was Rome that was grinding him under its heel. And Caesar was demanding his money. His method of collecting taxes? Supreme simplicity. He put the job out for bid. Matthew was a first-century Jew who had bid for the privilege of collecting the enemy's taxes from his own people. It'd be like one of you men bidding for the privilege of collecting Russia's taxes in Cleveland. Do you know how he'd be loved? When he walked down the street, every Jew deliberately turned their back to him, not permitting him to see their face. If they were forced to look at him, they spit in his face. That, too, was the custom. He had absolutely no friends except the other tax collectors and the posses, until one day a carpenter walked by. He said, "Hey, Matt, how would you like to follow me?" He got up from his table, walked away, never went back, and if we can believe tradition, it's only tradition, we can't prove it. He died an awfully horrible death in a place that we call Iran. But at that moment of time, of all those men walking with Jesus, not one of them but Matthew would have talked to a dog or a pig, what they called the Roman legionnaires. Matthew dealt with Romans. Matthew knew Romans by their first names. Romans had been keeping him alive for we don't know how long. You see, we don't really know which tax he was collecting. But regardless of type, it called for a table set up in town, and a Roman legionnaire standing in back of him with a sharp spear, as much to keep him alive as to assist in collecting his taxes. See, a traitor is number 1 on any patriot's hit list in any conquered nation, and Matthew was a traitor. Suppose it was the personal tax. Caesar might say your tax was 50. Matt would look you over, decide he could get 100 for the jacket. That was your tax. If you wanted to argue, he collected from your estate, right on the spot. He never lost. He got extremely wealthy and extremely hated. But he dealt with Romans. And that gets awfully, awfully heavy when you realize that the 28th chapter of the book of Matthew is the only one in the entire Bible that could have been dictated by a Roman legionnaire. Sure, Matthew wrote it. But the information in that chapter could never have been given to him by anybody in the world but a Roman soldier, because there was a Roman guard in the tomb of Jesus. For this, I wound up in the Library of Congress. I discovered that the book we needed was awfully difficult to get in this country. It's almost classified. The Military Institutions of the Roman Legion, written in the year 390 by a character named Flavius Frigidius Renatus. Imagine doing that to a poor innocent baby. Somebody must have hated that baby before he was born. He was a Roman military historian. By the year 390, the Legion had begun to fall apart. Caesar wanted to restore it to what it had been in the first century. Flavius was telling him how. He described the Roman Guard at the time of Christ. It was not 2 or 3 sleepy-eyed characters, the way the painters usually show it, leaning on a stick. It was a fixed fighting unit, very similar to today's Green Beret or Navy SEALs. That's why the book's so difficult to get in this country. Our own military would just as soon you didn't read it. We discovered that our own Green Beret is being trained by the principals in that book. That's how rough they were. Napoleon said they never went anywhere without a copy of that book in his pocket. Apparently, the only person who should have read it and didn't was Caesar. The Legion was destroyed. But a Roman Guard consisted of anywhere from 4 to 20 men, usually 16, superbly trained with a spear, a short sword, a dagger. Each man carried 5 javelins in the curve of his shield. Each man carried a sling, his primary weapon, with which he was trained to make one swing around his head and heave a 1-pound rock 70 feet and get a 12 to 14-inch post every single time at 70 feet. These jokers were lethal. If you can believe Flavius, they could pick off the head, stomach, or feet at will at 70 feet. They fought back to back in a geometrical pattern, each man responsible for only 6 square feet of space and his buddy's back. When one man moved, they all moved. A living fighting tank. As far as I could find out, they never lost a fight. They were considered invincible in the 1st century. This is what was guarding the tomb of Jesus. To make it better, Polybius describes them about 2 centuries before Christ. He says that if a guard was assigned to sentry duty and 1 man out of 16 fell asleep, all 16 would be executed because they had failed their mission. Fantastic. But that meant that if you were on a guard and you looked sleepy, you had 15 buddies whose lives depended on you staying awake. They'd have propped you up on the points of 15 spears if they had to. This was not American justice. The trial would be convened within the hour by the tribunes of the legion. If you were found guilty, Polybius said you'd always be found guilty. That's predestination. Your own tribune touched you on the shoulder with a vine staff, the signal for the entire battalion to beat you into hamburger with clubs and stones. Your best friend had to take a swing at you. Then a trumpet would be blown for every Roman executed to let the whole world know, if this is the way we handle ours, what do we do to you? Fantastic. And a few years ago, there was a book called The Passover Plot that said that 16 of these characters fell asleep. They snored mightily, in unison, maybe in harmony, while a collection of itinerant fishermen, an ex-crooked tax collector, a 14-year-old boy, and maybe a few women, sneaked in by night, quietly. They rolled at least 1.5 tons uphill, quietly. They stole the body of Jesus, and they got away with it. Well, anything is possible in this crazy old world of ours, but that's awfully high in my list of improbabilities. To make it better, the stone was sealed with Pilate's seal. That one was easy. A gob of wax or clay on each side of the stone, 2 more vertically, 2 leather thongs, a gob of wax where they crossed, Pilate's ring, applied in the presence of the legion. The penalty for breaking the seal of Rome without authorization? Crucifixion, upside down. If they couldn't find you, they'd round up every man, woman, and child in a given village or town and crucify the whole place. That's why Hitler learned it. You simply did not break the seal of Rome without authorization. We did not intend to do all this, but I think that we have shown rather conclusively that never in the history of mankind has the body of a condemned criminal been as securely guarded as was Jesus of Nazareth. All Rome was going to make sure that he didn't come out of that hole. That's why nobody but one of them, the pride of the Roman legion, could possibly have told Matthew what he wrote. And nobody but Matt would have talked to a Roman to find out what he had to say. Yeah, it's like a drumhead. You see, they were there to guard a seal. If that seal got broken, 16 Romans died. They'd have killed anyone who came within 70 feet of it. That's what they were there for. Nobody in their right mind would go near the garden. Sure, the women came back in innocence on Sunday. They didn't know the soldiers were there. While they were home obeying their holiday laws, their own high priest was breaking them by going to Pilate and asking for a Roman guard on the Sabbath. The only thing in context that makes any sense is the Romans must have gone over the hill before the women showed up. Because if it was a question of 3 or 4 women or 16 Romans, guess who just lost that fight? So nobody in the world but a Roman soldier could possibly have told Matthew that at some time between sundown on Saturday night and sunrise of the day that we call the first Easter, an angel descended. The appearance of the angel was like lightning. There was a severe earthquake. The stone was rolled away. The God became like dead men. Jesus came out. Now that's first century language. There's no theologian of any denomination who's going to try to tell you that the Holy Spirit gave the writers of the Bible a supernatural language in which to write, a language that every generation would understand. That is not true. Each man wrote in the language he himself spoke with a vocabulary at his own command. And that's one of the reasons we have so many different translations of the Bible. It has to be retranslated every generation so that each generation has it in the language they themselves speak. I do not speak the same English my father did. Over half of you don't speak the same English I do. You're a different generation. And I know what I'm talking about. I got a 25-year-old son. I swear we don't even communicate. Oh, we think alike. Dave travels around with an NIV under his arm most of the time. No matter where I go in the world, along about Wednesday or Thursday, he tracks me down. Always collect. Someday they'll learn to pay their own telephone bills. He said it's his job to make sure that I haven't become apostate and gone over the hill with a blonde. He's got to keep me straight. It's different when your son's checking on you. I like it, but we don't communicate. The simplest word that everybody in this congregation understands is the word gay. I grew up understanding that word to mean happy, joyful, ebullient, merry, having a good time. Does somebody want to tell me it means that today? If that word were in the Bible more than the one time it does appear in the KJV, in James, something about gay clothing, it's no problem. We'd have to retranslate every copy of the Bible there was to make it mean what the original language meant. What I'm saying is that if you really think about it, you know doggone well that the meanings of words change from one generation to another. In less than one generation, the meaning of that word has changed over 180. Matthew was a first century Jew. He was writing in first century Greek. Was he saying something that the people of his generation understood perfectly and we don't? Was he using words, I've made my point, the Greek's famous for it, that have more than one meaning? We had to find out. We took that story apart almost a syllable at a time, only looking for answers to our own questions. We found our key in the word earthquake, seismic, seismology, seismograph. But the literal translation of that word then and today is a severe commotion. The only important thing being, where is the commotion happening? If it's in the ground, a seismus is an earthquake. If the commotion is in the air, then and today you would translate it wind, gale, tempest. Matthew used the word in the 8th chapter to describe the storm on the Sea of Galilee. When Jesus rebuked the seismus and the waves were still, he rebuked the wind. Aristotle taught that earthquakes were only severe gales blowing through subterranean caverns, making the ground rumble, rattle, and roll. To the first century Jew, to the first century Greek, it was only a question of where is the big wind blowing. The appearance of the angel, not his features, but his idea, his aspect, he looked like, he appeared to be, a brilliant white light, a flash, a glare, a burst of white light, something that's going to light up the entire sky, lightning. At which point the scream was, hallelujah, we got it. If you haven't noticed, I haven't told you what produced these images in back of me, and I can't. Up until October of 1981, I'd have said we know. But until 120 of the best names in the world, and I'm not one of them, could sign the paper and give it to the world for free, we're not talking. We did everything imaginable to avoid sensationalism, to keep anyone from making a buck out of it. It didn't work, but we tried. Today I've got to say that after 6 years plus of the most intensive research that science is capable of bringing to bear on anything, we do not know what produced the image on the Shroud of Turin. When we had the symposium in October of '81 at Connecticut College in New London, UConn at Avery Point, they came from all over the world. 2 teams from Australia, Nippon Television, all over Europe, all over this country. All but 1 team packed up and went back home when they found out that there were not going to be any sensational announcements. This is or is not Jesus. He was or was not resurrected. They were demanding sensationalism. I always felt that what they got was sensational enough. I couldn't believe it the first time I heard it. They were told, and they did very little with it, that the image on the Shroud of Turin is not a forgery. It was not made by human hands. How's that for a statement by modern science? It was not made by human hands. It is not possible for modern science to duplicate it. We know how to put a team on the moon, and we can do it again. We don't know how to reproduce this image. It appears to have been produced by something that resulted in the oxidation, dehydration, and the conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibers of the linen itself. Or there might be 5 honest people in this room. The rest of you chemists already know that that's nothing but scientist double talk, unless you happen to be a chemist, for the fact that the image is a scorch. It's burned down to the topmost fibers of the cloth. But what produced that burn is beyond the capability of modern science to duplicate in the laboratory. And one of the unbreakable laws of science is that no matter what you're looking at, no matter what you believe you have in your hand, unless you can duplicate it in the lab, you're forced to say you don't understand it. You simply don't understand something you can't duplicate. How do you duplicate a one-shot? Something which doesn't seem to have happened before. It certainly hasn't happened since. This is very crude, but it's the best I can do. If you can imagine pulling one hair out of your head, scorch one face of that hair. Do not get the sides, definitely not the bottom. Scorch one face of one hair. You might be able to duplicate one aspect of the problem, but that can't be done. Again, this is crude. If you can imagine an infinite number of laser beams This is not laser. It is non-isotropic. There's no diffusion. One for every single pore in the body, coming out in a straight line, vertical mapping, scorching an uncountable number of tiny dots, almost like a newspaper picture under magnification, only on the topmost fibers of the cloth. Again, you might be able to duplicate another aspect of the problem. But that type of energy doesn't exist on Earth. There's only some indication of it on a 14-foot-long piece of cloth in Italy. So what happens? It's back to the lab, maybe forever. We are planning to go back to Italy as quickly as possible, as soon as the church will let us have the cloth, if they will. Every question that was answered in 1978 has raised 10 new ones that no one could possibly have conceived of at that time. Every theory that anyone has ever come up with has been tried. Chemistry is 100% done on the cloth. It completely refutes physics. How do you tell someone in school that the laws of physics are no longer immutable? We have something that says they're wrong, and yet they're right. Chemistry, X-ray fluorescence, ultraviolet, infrared totally preclude the possibility of paint having been used on this cloth. There is absolutely nothing on this cloth that could have been used to produce pigment in any form whatsoever, despite what you might have read in some of the newspapers. They overkilled the point. They had to refute a book which shouldn't have been written. They certainly overkilled it. It is not a painting. The Rolling Stones had a theory. It was tried. They published it. It was tried. It didn't work. I've spoken on many campuses. You tell the kids in school that their theory is as good as someone else's, and boy, you get theories. Every so often you hear a new one. Call a lab, ask them to try it. Nothing worked. What I'm saying is that nobody was rejected based on how old they were or who they were. One theory is as good as another, yet nothing worked. Up until October of 1981, there was only one theory that almost everybody could buy. It was a statement made in one of the world's biggest laboratories. The image on the Shroud of Turin could only have been produced by what may turn out, ultimately, to have been the greatest burst of radiant energy ever known to man, possibly exceeding even that of a nuclear bomb, emanating uniformly from every pore of the man's body, from the inside out, in a millisecond of time. I once timed a strobe light at an airport at 9 times a second. This would have been 1,000. In a thousandth of a second or less, producing a temperature that one man estimated had to have been in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough in a millisecond to scorch the cloth, but not destroy it. Undoubtedly, this would be the experience the Christians normally call the resurrection. Bong! Except I've got to say, how do you duplicate the resurrection in a laboratory? That's our problem. Now, I got no way to prove why. I stick my neck out every time I say it. I'm some kind of a biblical fundamentalist. I don't know what kind. I haven't figured that out yet. But I'm some kind. Primarily because science has yet to disprove even one story in the Bible. It looks as if there's evidence that maybe there was a man and a woman named Adam and Eve. Maybe. There's a boat on top of a mountain in the desert. We know what the mechanics of the flood were all about. The Bible even seems to talk about the point in time when the continental drift began, and it looks as if a couple of men, one from the University of Pennsylvania, the other either Illinois or Indiana, had just uncovered Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain. And we can even tell you how a woman could, or a man, could conceivably be turned into something that resembles a pillar of salt in only one spot on Earth that anyone knows of where the conditions are geologically correct. And because those stories appear to have been at least tied down pretty good, I can buy the rest of them, the ones we can't prove. Because of that, I'm not hanging anything on anybody, but I'm only saying where I'm coming from, and I wish I could explain them to you. But because of that, because that's the way I think, I've had to look at every theory that anyone has ever come up with for the image-producing mechanism on the Shroud of Turin with those eyes. Because if anything were to contradict that story I've told you this evening, this isn't Jesus. I have my biblio with me. About every fourth word is nailed down. It's withstood a great deal of scrutiny. What you've heard tonight is historical fact. If anything were to have contradicted, I'd never believe that this was Jesus. Even if it did, I'd want to be part of it. There's one Jewish genius traveling the world with a set of slides and a light boiler saying, what's a good Jewish boy like me doing working on a Catholic relic? My family tells me I'm crazy. I tell them, you find me a better game and you can deal me in. In the meantime, I'm going to play in this one. Me too. It's the best game in town. But nothing has contradicted it. And it's too late for it to happen now. But only one theory fits in. And no, we cannot prove it. We may never prove it. But suppose someday, and it's happened in the past, Every telephone in the United States and England all go off at the same time. Some lab is screaming, you won't believe what we just found. Nope, never do. You just check it. Suppose this time we've got the frequency. Now we can talk about it. Radiant energy. It doesn't have to be thermonuclear. Those lights are radiant energy. If you don't believe it, come up here and stand with me. So is sunlight, X-ray. But almost every single time when it occurs in a burst, it's accompanied by a brilliant white light, a flash, a glare, a burst of white light, something that's going to light up the entire sky. With or without a mushroom cloud, with or without sound, that white light is there just about every time. And sure, I believe in angels. I can tell you angel stories from now until tomorrow afternoon. I know too many people who have seen them and talked to them. And these kids wouldn't dare lie. They're scared. I've been present when they were. As I said, I've got loads of stories. I just don't believe that at that hour before dawn, before the Jewish women showed up, and incidentally, the Bible does say that 4 writers that tell us that the women saw angels. I don't believe that hour before the Jewish women showed up that the Romans saw an angel. I think that what they saw was the mechanics, the cause and effect of the resurrection, how the Father went about raising his Son, and they did not have the vocabulary with which to describe it. The term radiant energy did not exist in the first century. It's possible that we know too much about it. Is it possible that the Roman legion told Matthew that there was a tremendous burst of white light? The stone went sailing over their heads. Jesus came out, and because the women had seen angels and Matthew believed the women, maybe he thought the Romans did? I don't know. But try this on for size. A Middle Eastern night. There's no pollution in southern Israel even today. There are nights when the stars are bigger than saucers. No rain at this time of year. Dead silence. Nobody in their right mind would go anywhere near the garden. The body very thoroughly dead, wrapped in a sheet, lying on some kind of a slab. The Romans were not asleep. Polybius said, and he was no Christian, that they would be checked every hour and a half maximum by a centurion to make sure that they were awake and on duty. They would probably have been bored to tears, but they'd have been leaning on their spears looking for trouble. Suddenly something, and science has no hope of ever proving what it was. One nuke said, give it up. We just don't understand the physics of a miracle. Something within that body triggers the most unbelievable burst of radiant energy ever known. Instantaneously heated to something over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, any nuke is going to tell you that the air in that tomb, which should have been cold and stale and dead and damp after 3 days of being sealed up, heated that high, that rapidly, would have to expand at least 3 to 5 psi, pounds per square inch. They'll also tell you that that's the principle of a nuclear bomb, that mountain would vanish and take most or all of Jerusalem along with it, if the tomb were tightly corked. But it wasn't. That huge boulder at the mouth of the tomb would have been like a paper cap on the end of a glass milk bottle. That's seismus, and this is a legitimate translation which no one could possibly have made before 1979. That shock wave, or that thermal wind, would have hit that rock and lifted it right over the head of the Roman god. Of course they went catatonic. They froze. They became like dead men. So would every man in this room, including me, when something like that happened. Then when he came walking out of the tomb, apparently they became non-catatonic. They began to put one foot in front of the other just as rapidly as they could do it, and who wouldn't? They checked out of that piece of real estate. And it's interesting that the pride of the Roman legion did not report to their own centurion in Antonia. They checked in with a Jewish high priest. Now, someone said there's 2 good reasons. Number 1, who wants to get converted to instantaneous dog food? Number 2, when something like that happens, you find the nearest priest, regardless of what his denomination is. You got problems. Over the centuries, theologians have often said that the gospel writer John had a horrible Greek vocabulary. He had picked the wrong word to describe the movement of the stone. Until today, no translator ever considered the legitimate translation wind. There was never a wind big enough to move a 3,000-pound rock. There isn't a person in this room tonight who could deny that there is such a wind. You cannot ignore that translation anymore. It's at least got to be checked out. They never knew what to do with the word airu that John used to describe the movement of the stone. Until today, a seismist could only roll a stone that big. Airu has no connotation to rolled. It means picked up, lifted, moved, physically carried, or sailed away. Today it looks as if John's vocabulary wasn't that bad, because wherever the stone came down, it sure as heck was not next to the entrance of the tomb. And that's the shroud. And what does it mean? If you're like me, Pastor A, the only people I really know in this room, nothing. I didn't need this cloth 6 years ago. I don't need it today. To risk an extremely lousy pun, my faith isn't all wrapped up in a sheet. But I was traveling over in the city, New York, not long ago with one of the team. I don't want to identify him. Let him tell his own story. But just accept, if you can, the fact that you can read his name in every encyclopedia in the world today. Somewhere along that rather wild ride, the man with me said, Paul, all of our lives we've worshipped a God called science. We believed only what we could see and what we could touch, nothing more. All of a sudden now, it's our God, science, that's saying that Jesus is Lord. And what in the heck do you do with that? He said, it isn't that we want to believe, but either we have to accept the fact that it's not us, it's our equipment that's saying that this is Jesus of Nazareth and he was resurrected, or we have to scrap the most sophisticated equipment the world has, unless Russia's got something better, and we doubt it. Because it's not us, it's the equipment. And if that's true, this whole thing's like a computer, 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 2 is 4. If that's true, it doesn't mean a blessed thing what my wife believes. It's what the heck am I going to do with it? Well, he did. I prayed with him. Let me show you something. I've got to say that this is not an official statement of the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Neither, of course, is an unofficial statement. I'm only showing you something that I see. This is the back of a man that's been skinned alive the hard way. I've made my point. He's lying with a dead weight of 155 pounds pressed on a piece of linen cloth. He must have been glued to it. Everybody in this room has cut themselves at least once and put a bandage on it, or Band-Aid. And you know blood sticks. I actually found one tribe in New Guinea that glues their drum heads on with human blood. It's that strong. Some of us are old enough to have had a bandage ripped off, either accidentally or deliberately by a doctor. Two things happen every single time. Number one, you scream bloody murder. It hurts. Number two, you bleed because you ripped the clots off. Yet look at this. Every wound is unique and distinct. The doctors say that it's just as easy to do a forensic examination on these two photographs as it is an actual corpse. They're that clear. You can see, we know how many men were involved because the strokes proceed from lateral to medial, indicating two people coming from different directions. We know that one man was taller than the other. His arm was longer. He could reach further. He was a lot nastier. He enjoyed cutting up the front of the body. You can see the bar of metal connecting the dumbbell-shaped pieces of lead. You can see where they were curving around to get the front of the body. They missed his legs with the balls of lead. I don't think they were aiming at his legs. The lashes sliced through the thighs like razor blades, cutting him to the bone. The serum and plasma have separated, forms a tiny halo around each drop of blood, fluorescing precisely the way blood should fluoresce on linen cloth. What I'm saying is that there is no conceivable way that this cloth could have been taken off of the body of the man that was in it without destroying it. It should have been torn to shreds. There should be holes in it. And yet, under 300 power magnification, there isn't a broken microfiber. Do you have a brainstorm? I'm serious. We could use one. Yes, you could say possibly that his body turned into dust. It blew away, left an empty sheet, except that one Italian scientist managed to do the impossible. He had used a laboratory vacuum cleaner. He took a dust sample from every 6-inch grid on the cloth. In less than 3 years, he had identified every fleck of dust that was on the cloth and put a tag on it. He found some rather incredible things: gold, silver, rosin. At some point in history, somebody had held a torch over the cloth, examined it by torchlight. Rosin dripped on the cloth and burned through 42 layers, or burned through some extra holes in it. I got my fires mixed up. But there was nothing on this cloth that could have been produced by the human body in either life or death except the blood. No decavern, no decay, no flesh, no body rot. Israel is a subtropical climate. The last time I was there, it was November. The temperature was still over 90 degrees in Tel Aviv. At that temperature, a body will begin to decay in something less than 4 days. The fact that there is no decavern on this cloth would seem to indicate that the cloth and the body had been separated in something less than 4 days. 3 maybe? But it wasn't separated. Again, got a bright idea? Unless you want to use a New Testament word called resurrection. I am not making a statement of fact. I'm only asking a question. Could it be at all conceivable that maybe, for a millisecond of time, his body turned into physical body, shifted forms of energy. Our body is energy of a type. Shifted forms of energy became pure energy, maybe a blue-white light, passed through the cloth, scorching an image on it, triggering the chain reaction that we call the resurrection, expanding the air, blowing the stone away, dissipating the heat, providing an exit, totally lapsed time, 1/1000th of a second or less. But boy, does it look suspicious. Pastor, check me out, because I'm going to use the Bible. You keep me from becoming apostate. Jesus was in the beginning before time began. He always was. He's immortal.
Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? I am.
He and the Father are of the same essence. That word essence means identical. You cannot think of any conceivable way that Father and Son are different. God is light. Do you know what that's saying? And I've never known of anyone to ever write on it for 2,000 years, if they ever saw it. If Jesus is the same as the Father, if they both always were, and if the Father is light, then at some time before time began, Jesus must have been light. Could it at all be possible that that's what we're dealing with here? That maybe what we have here could have been scorched by what the Jews call the Shekinah glory? Could that be what that brilliant white light was that appeared in the temple of the Jews historically at least 3 or 4 times? So brilliant that every Jewish person had to throw themselves down on the ground and cover their head with their hands because they couldn't stand up in front of it? The actual visible presence of the living God? Is that what scorched the image on the Shroud of Turin? I don't know. It's there. I'm working like mad trying to get it, but I still got a hunch in the back of my mind that we'll never tie it down tight. But it looks awfully good. Don't have to tell you what it means either, do I? 850 audiences in 6 or 7 countries, and you catch up with me awfully fast. Christianity rises and falls on the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus was resurrected, he was God. If he wasn't resurrected, Christianity is the biggest farce, the biggest fraud that's ever been perpetrated on mankind. And there's nothing in between. It's either God or garbage. I've been accused of a great many things over the years, but nobody ever accused me of tact. It's too late to worry about it now. It's absolutely stupid to call him a good man. He did not give us that prerogative. It's either God or garbage. And sure, I've known for more years than 90% of you here have been alive, that Jesus is alive and well. I've been there. I've experienced most of it. There isn't anything left to talk about. I've seen all but 2 miracles mentioned in the New Testament take place while I was present. I have yet to see someone walk across Long Island Sound in the summertime. There's always been a bridge or a ferry. We never needed it. I have yet to see someone turn water into booze. But I've never known anyone that needed a drink that bad either. I've seen the rest. Repeatedly, many times, with these eyes. It's too late to convince me that Jesus isn't alive and well. I've been there. They didn't even talk me out of it in school. But I never thought I would ever live to see the day that I could point at something and say, hey, kids, historically, archaeologically, scientifically confirmed data that seems to be saying a first-century Jew was resurrected. What are you going to do with that? Some of us think that possibly the whole project was tied together by a cute little red-headed kid of about 17, somewhere in the state of Vermont. I never heard this kid's name. I don't remember what town I was in. I've been in many. All I remember is a cute little redhead coming up and saying, doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible, Paul, that before Jesus can return, the gospel has to be translated into every language that there is? Sure. Isn't this translating it into the language of science? That kid, whoever she was smarter than all the rest of us put together. Thanks to a 2,000-year-old rag that none of us really wanted. Today we have the gospel in the international language of science, chemistry, physics, numbers. And you don't really have to hand the scientist the Bible. You refer them to IEEE and the 2 segments, 1 chemistry, 1 physics, for the interim final report on the project. You watch their eyes go like that. The data seems to be saying a first-century Jew was resurrected. I always believed in God. I always believed Jesus was his son. I have no idea really why, but I did. And no one ever talked me out of it in school. But nobody ever told me that intellectual assent didn't cut the ice, that you've got to drop it from your head to your heart. And if you don't, it's worthless to you. And if they told me I had to do it, I wouldn't have known how. I paid an awfully high price to get that information. But and that's a different story. But when I finally did get into that book for something besides intellectualism, I turned a sick green. because I discovered that it's talked about only one thing from the first page to the last. Nobody wants to hear it anymore. They call it hell and damnation. But that's all that's there. If you sin once, you burn, because there's no penalty for sin except death. And since everybody sinned, and that's easy, have you ever done anything you hope nobody finds out about? If you've sinned once, you've had it. You burn. And I can even handle that. This is pseudoscience. I don't pretend it's anything else. But there seems to be a good bit of evidence, more than what I've mentioned tonight, that God really is light. If that's true, you don't even have to tell a small child that there's something black about sin. We know it. We all know it instinctively. Sin is dark, black. God is light. What happens when you throw a light switch in a dark room? The darkness is obliterated. Light and darkness cannot exist in the same place at the same time. Now, I'm being ridiculous, of course, but God could even be crying, and yet, because of his very nature, because of who and what he is, he would have to destroy anyone who came into his presence with sin in them, because he couldn't help it. I said that's pseudoscience, but it certainly helped me to understand it a lot. Comes the part I don't understand, and I'm not going to believe a pastor if he tells me he understands it, because I think that it's like trying to understand eternity, infinity, something that has no beginning and no end. Don't try to do it. You need a computer for that. Our minds simply aren't big enough. I think that this kind of love falls into the same category, that God could love us so much that he would know that every one of us are damned because we're all sinned. We've all sinned, and there's nothing we can do about it. So God becomes a man and dies the most horrible death I have ever heard of anyone dying. For me, I can't grasp that. I can handle a lot of things, but I can't handle that one intellectually or any other way. That's too big. And yet I've experienced it for a great many years. You see, it's not at all inconceivable that there's people in this room who, like me, always believed in God. Some of you might have even believed that Jesus was the Son. But then, too, like me, maybe no one ever told you that you had to do something with that information, that you have to drop it to your heart. I know you've never heard it the way I phrased it tonight. I'm just going to ask you, I'm not going to give a formal altar call or anything like that. It's not right at this moment. I'm just going to ask you to pray along with me, if you believe. If you don't, don't. But if you believe, pray along with me. And those of you who have already done it, it won't hurt you to recommit your life, because I've done it 100 times. Lord Jesus, I confess that I'm a sinner. I have done things that I'm not proud of. I ask you to forgive me. I ask you to be my Lord, my God, my Savior, my King. I promise that I will follow you as you show me the way. I know that you have said that you would never refuse anyone who came to you, that there is no sin too big to be forgiven, that if I have prayed this prayer and meant it, even now you are living in my life. I am born again. In your name, Jesus.
What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communism.
ODD-TV. Take a journey with me deep inside the rabbit hole. Wake up, my friends, there's some things that you have to know. Everything you ever thought you knew, it has to go. For instance, NASA is the world's largest magic show. 9/11 was a planned demolition and Sandy Hook was a scam. Come on, man, are you tripping? Constant programming being crammed in your vision. Just take a step back and examine this prison. Turn on the news and they're trying to blind you. All they ever do is tell you lies and divide you. There's nowhere you can even hide, they'll find you. Illuminati all-seeing eye right behind you. It's about time you find out we're being lied to. They're attempting to control the mind that's inside you, hide you from the power that designed you. Does anybody have a problem with this? Well, I do. I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.